Hello, everyone. Welcome, bienvenue. Welcome to this gathering of the heritage sector on federal election 2021, a conversation with the National Trust for Canada, the Indigenous Heritage Circle, the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals, and Ecomos Canada to talk about heritage and the looming federal election. Why don't you just, as you're joining the call, say hello in the chat box. Let us know what organization or group you might be representing today and what your interest is. I'm happy to have you here on the line. My name is Natalie Bull. I'm Executive Director of the National Trust for Canada. And I'm here participating in this call in New Brunswick from the unceded traditional territory of the Wolastoqiyik people, here within sight of the beautiful river they call the Wolastoq. Just a word about the National Trust. We can go to the next slide. It's our pleasure to host these national gatherings of the sector, something that we started doing at the beginning of the pandemic as a way to bring people together and to hear from the entire sector. Government relations and advocacy is an important part of the work that we do at the Trust. And as a charity, obviously we can't be partisan, but we think it's an important part of our work to make sure that heritage advocates are out there active, speaking to elected officials, and that together we are doing our work to influence public policy. So that's part of what we're doing here today with this call. On the next slide, you can see that we have a distinguished group of leaders of national heritage organizations here on the line with us, and I'll introduce them all in a moment. But this call is really about the entire sector. So the format that we have today will allow anyone to participate live on screen. You can turn on your camera and turn on your microphone. Maybe I'll suggest that people raise their hands if they'd like to weigh in, but we definitely want to have as much participation as we can. You can either participate live or share your comments and your questions using the chat and the Q&A, and we'll do our best to watch for those and to bring those points into the conversation as well. Je vous encourage de poser des questions dans la langue de votre choix, même de présenter dans la langue de votre choix. We're happy to run a bilingual conversation here today. And so on the line with us, representing national heritage organizations, we have Cody Grote, the president of Indigenous Heritage Circle. You can just wave, Cody. And Keisha Supernant, who's on the board of the Indigenous Heritage Circle. We have Christophe Rivet, the president of Ecomos Canada. And I think Stéphane Presso, the executive director of Ecomos Canada, might be joining us by phone from his vacation. We have Theodora Samiotis, who is leading advocacy work in partnership between CAP and Ecomos Canada. Hello, Theodora. And we have the president of CAP, Chris Uchiyama. And then from the Trust, myself and my colleague, Chris Weave, our manager of Heritage Policy and Government Relations. So briefly, the agenda for today, we're going to start by summarizing input that we received from the heritage sector at a gathering held earlier this summer to get ready for a federal budget submission. And in the meantime, as we all know, a federal election was called. So we used that information to develop questions for the federal parties, as well as providing some input, some information along with those questions about the asks that the sector, the priority recommendations that the sector has. We will also share the questions that we pose to the parties and show you what the parties are saying to date or not saying about heritage in their party platforms. And then we'll really just convene an open discussion. We want to hear from the leaders of these heritage organizations and hear from all of you about what you're doing now around advocacy for this federal election, what organizations are doing, and then to also talk about action into the future, because the election is, it's just the beginning, obviously, of a new phase of government relations and advocacy for the heritage sector. So I think I'll turn it over now to my colleague, Chris Weave, who will run us through some of the background information that, in fact, you can find all of these documents on our website under what you can do, action. Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks so much, Natalie. And I'm coming to you from Ottawa, which is the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. And I actually grew up in Treaty 6 in Edmonton. So really happy to be here today. So just really quickly bringing us up to speed on the various asks that went into the election kind of briefing question document. And it really kind of rolls back to our conversation with many of you at a gathering we held in July, mid-July 15th, that was focused on the pre-budget submission that we sent into the House of Commons Finance Committee in advance of budget 2022. We needed to get our asks together, but we were also very cognizant that election was simmering on the horizon, if that metaphor works. So actually was interesting conversation, and lots of good things came out there. I mean, people were telling us, we're saying, be less bureaucratic and more punchy. Don't create a position paper, but a call to action. Tried to tread a middle ground with this particular document and tried to skinny it back, but it's still, I guess the challenge with the heritage movement is you still need to explain why some of these calls to action and recommendations fit within certain kinds of contexts. So it's hard to skinny it back completely. So we settled on 3 different key areas. One was on climate change, another on reconciliation, and another on jobs and the economy. So one of the 3 of the recommendations that came out here on the climate change front, not so different from what we've been asking for. One was around, the adaptive reuse and retrofit funding for heritage buildings. There's a lot of retrofit money floating around for general activity. Wanted this one focused on that, and we wanted a solid amount of money to actually make that happen. There was also the second one there, which was around decarbonization, and that was really coming back to the distortions that are embedded within the federal tax system, facilitating or pushing people towards demolition as opposed to reuse. Which is really, an important part of decarbonizing is using what we have better and stop using so much carbon. So wanted to get that in there too, and it resonated with what we had talked about in July. The recommendation number 3 was around trying to connect the dots between, the embodied energy, which was also identified in an an Environment Committee, House of Commons Environment Committee report, Better Buildings, back in 2018, which actually tasked the federal government with integrating embodied energy calculations within its procurement and other kind of processes. That needs to go further, and there needs to be some interconnections with carbon pollution pricing systems and others to really give that velocity. So haven't seen much on that yet, but hopeful. So next slide, please, Holly. And then the other section was on Indigenous cultural heritage and reconciliation. And I think that we've all seen the need for having that kind of capacity there for an organization like the Indigenous Heritage Circle to really be helping to lead this part of the larger sector too. And we absolutely need this at this time. And I guess we'll hear a bit later about whether the party platforms or some of the things that we're seeing circulating are actually addressing that. There's a lot of talk around reconciliation generally in broad brushstrokes, but sometimes a little less particularly. So that was one of the key recommendations there. And then the next slide, please. The other 3 were around jobs, and those ones and around job training with around number 5 in terms of creating space for good rehabilitation work to happen. We need to have the skilled trades there. Actually seeing some of that in the party platforms, but we'll get to that. Because there's a lot of calls to do retrofits, but maybe it's not being done in the right way or in a sensitive way that actually leverages the durable and durable materials involved in traditional construction techniques. We also wanted to point to, in recommendation 6, to the Canada's the national cost sharing program for heritage places, and the need for that. One of the challenges in our sector is there's so many different kinds of heritage places. One's open to the public, one's owned by private individuals as homes, others as commercial, some as institutional. trying to push all those different buttons, we have different kinds of asks here. So that's one that we know there is a huge need for in that smaller but very important group of buildings under National Historic Sites and lighthouses and train stations. Then there's also recommendation 7, which was around really trying to foster and accelerate integration of the next generation into the cultural heritage sector by leveraging existing programs like YCW and others to create pathways into our sector. So I wanted to hit that note there too, coming out of our conversation. So here's next slide, please, Holly. And then here are the questions that we actually put into our briefing document, which is online, August 2021. Asking parties around the climate action questions, around how they will encourage building reuse, how they will support, cultural heritage capacity and reconciliation, and also the question around creating green jobs and building reuse. Natalie, did you want to jump in with something there, or no? I think we're good. Okay.
We sent those questions off to the federal party presidents, and then followed up sending them as well to the party leaders and to the environment critics.
So we've heard back from the Green Party at this point, but we haven't heard back from the others. And that's not to be a surprise on a short kind of election cycle like this. They often come quite late, but we can get inklings from the different parties on what they're saying now. So the next slide, please, Holly. And then I'll open it up to our other heritage organization members to give us insights that they've been seeing. The Conservative Party, it's interesting. I'm just alphabetical order here on no favoritism here on who's being displayed first. The Conservative Party, it's interesting because they were the ones to really sort of explicitly mention heritage places in terms of their funding proposals in their platform. They haven't responded to us yet, but we've looked at their document. And they're proposing to create this new Canadian Heritage Preservation Fund of $75 million in grants to municipal governments, particularly for certain kinds of restorations around monuments and statues and heritage buildings, weighing right into a lot of challenging circumstances there with that particular role. But it was one of the shout outs to heritage places, one of the only explicit shout outs to heritage places that we've seen. They've also talked at length around retrofitting and building up the skilled trades. If you look in their clean buildings plan part of their platform, they talk about that and about continuing to develop building codes to support net zero and developing new solutions to speed up the pace of retrofits, particularly residential. These are places where the heritage community can insert their knowledge in saying, hey, you don't need new technologies. What you need is new ways of working with older technologies. The Green Party was really interesting because they sent in their response to us, and you'll find it online in that action section. And they were talking about, of course, about a massive energy efficiency retrofit of residential, commercial, and institutional buildings, beginning to catch a refrain here. But they also, in terms of Indigenous cultural heritage, they also said they wanted to support and sustain the transmission, proliferation, and regeneration of Indigenous cultural works and languages. So I think there's an interesting toehold in terms of more general and a strong roster of things that they're proposing, where it's explicitly connecting with heritage places. There could be others. And they also talk about, in terms of the jobs, around a just transition plan for workers to move away from traditional industries, particularly oil and gas, but I think you could also equate it with the new construction industry, which is predicated on certain kinds of ideas, and investing in comprehensive retraining programs for the new zero carbon economy. I think there's a position for us. We can get involved in that whole kind of discussion if we position ourselves. Okay, quickly, Liberals. What I saw, maybe you saw other things, the retrofit economy section there is really interesting of their platform, page 45. we've seen some of this in the pre-announcements around, homeowners grants for energy retrofits, $5,000, and others if up to $40,000 for deep retrofits. We know some of the challenges around ripping out windows or doors potentially, but I think there's other opportunities for us to connect in with that. They also want to launch a national net zero emissions building strategy, and not sure what the parameters for that are, if it's just looking at new or looking at retrofits of rehabilitation of old. I think we've got a place there. The other last thing, I guess, would be on the NDP. And if you look at their Ready for Better platform, they also talk about retrofits, large scale building retrofits in all sectors. Big theme here, upgrades to buildings built before 2020. Decades. They also talk about the creation of a civilian climate corps with youth focused on new initiatives. A lot of them around natural heritage, but it could be positioned in a different way according to cultural heritage. So I think there's lots of toeholds in there, not tons of explicit shout outs, as I say, to cultural heritage, but I think it's up to us really to see how we can position ourselves within some of these larger thrusts. Going to our heritage organizations who are on the line, were there things that you were seeing or not seeing in platforms or the election discussions thus far that you want to throw on the table as well?
Chris, can I kick it off?
You bet.
As I love doing. There were some things that were interesting to me that stood out, and I think it sort of, I'm going to start with this point because it sort of differentiates and moves away from this built heritage perspective. But one thing that I saw a lot, for instance, in the Conservative platform, I was excited to see, for instance, that they have recommitted to the national monument, for example, in Ottawa for residential schools. So they're committing to that monument, which is a TRC call to action. They've also committed again to a commemorative strategy for unmarked graves at residential schools, which is again part of a TRC. But again, there's this aspect of commemoration that they're committing to. But there was also some parts where Indigenous cultural heritage, I think, was not mentioned, but also being explicitly referenced. I see, for example, how they want to fix the Impact Assessment Act, which might, we say this in the context of developing resource extraction, for instance. And the Impact Assessment Act has specific provisions to protect cultural and sacred sites for Indigenous communities. I also see how they want to impact or revise the Impact Assessment Act to, I'm going to read directly from their platform so I don't misspeak. So they can support culturally significant areas without alienating future development that might be advisable for this region. So I think it's, there's this conversation that they're having where there's this language about preserving Indigenous cultural heritage, but then at the same time putting in ways that those protections might also be revised and removed in the future. So that was something that stood out to me, which is not conventionally these things about retrofitting buildings necessarily, but is again this backdoor discussion about Indigenous cultural heritage. But again, I was surprised to see in the Conservative platform these very open commitments to the commemorative strategy for unmarked graves, for instance. I was also interested to see they are having a lot of discussion about, as all parties are, new national parks, for instance, but they have created a strategy that looks at the southern working landscape, as they refer to it, creating more national parks in southern Canada instead of just northern Canada, which again, I feel is an interesting perspective that they've done, and is again about cultural heritage, but not necessarily built structures, which we conventionally associate with cultural heritage. That's just my start for now, but I'll leave it there.
I wonder if I might just follow up a little bit. So one of the things that I noticed, for building on what Cody has already articulated, is that there tends to be in the different platforms an emphasis on either Indigenous Guardian programs, which of course are important and essential. And then the other area where you have often explicitly related to Indigenous cultural heritage is language, or things related to the TRC calls to action. And for me, there's a gap. So I'm an archaeologist. And what about our sort of archaeological places and cultural places that don't fall into either ecosystems or language and residential school landscapes. And this remains an ongoing issue, and because Indigenous heritage is broadly defined, and it incorporates all these different elements together, and there remains this tendency to divide them up and separate them out, and then there are gaps that are not addressed in any of the platforms as well. This does relate to the impact assessment process, because that is one area where sort of archaeological heritage is directly engaged with, because it's often considered in the impact assessment process. But as Cody pointed out, sort of giving space for that to be amended, and not necessarily in ways that would be supportive of Indigenous cultural heritage. So just some of the observations from the platforms that I also had.
And if I may, Chris,
Yeah.
I support the observations from our colleagues at the IHC. The two things that really struck me on top of that was the lack of focus on the federal responsibility. It seems to be diffuse in areas of jurisdiction that are not clearly federal. And I'm actually speaking to everyone from Grand Pré National Historic Site on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. And one of the things that reminds me of the federal focus is the need to invest in the national historic sites. A lot of the things that our national organizations have been repeating and testifying in Parliament and in Senate around the need to have the federal government demonstrate leadership in core areas is absent. And in fact, I would argue that the Conservative proposal, while interesting, may be challenging to pursue, because it has a direct relationship with the municipality, bypassing the provinces. So that's the first thing, is the absence of focus on the federal responsibility, despite the fact that all of us have for years clearly identified what those responsibilities are and how they can be resolved and improved. But the second element is you've highlighted how each platform talks about retrofitting and rehabilitation, energy efficiency, and so on, but it seems to lump together both existing and new builds. And we know that part of the challenge in our sector is to consider a different approach to reaching those goals of zero emission and energy efficiency for existing buildings. So I think one of our perhaps conclusions should be that we still have work to do to raise that distinction and advocate for a different approach to existing buildings versus applying the code for new builds.
Yeah, and if I could just pile on to that, I think both of these have a big implication in terms of the work that we're going to have to do, because things like the impact assessment process and act, and the fact that there's so much talk about building and adding, we're not going to build our way out of the climate crisis. So there seems to be this siloing of, on the one hand, we're going to retrofit some buildings, and on the other hand, all of the parties have a lot of discussion about building new homes, adding new infrastructure. So I'm concerned about that disconnect and where those gaps are as well.
I think Christoph really, sorry, Natalie. I think one point that Christoph made really struck my mind, and it's, again, I'm not going to articulate it well, but I look at the Liberal platform, and one of the things that they want to do, which is forge an international coalition to work on a new UNESCO Convention on the Diversity of Cultural Content Online. And again, I think that's interesting, but it's a new layer that they're adding. But there's already conventions in place, for example, to preserve intangible cultural heritage, which is great for our industry. There's a lot of people in the industry, in the field of heritage in Canada, who are advocating for this to be ratified. And Canada hasn't done it, and there's not this effort to do that from the federal government, which I think is interesting, either major party. And again, there's this effort to add a new layer. Instead of doing this, which there's vocal calls for within the heritage industry, we're going to work towards developing a new UNESCO convention to address something else, diversity of cultural content online, which again has its different priorities and different impacts. But it's almost what Christoph is saying in a kind of very vague similarity way, is they're not working towards what we're already trying to advocate and push for. They're adding this other layer on top, which addresses a different problem, but kind of has the facade of addressing a similar problem.
I was
That's
gonna
right,
say,
Cody. And oh, sorry, Natalie. I
Sorry,
can't see
Christoph.
if anyone wishes to intervene. Sorry about that. Carry on.
No, I was just going to say that I'm reminded with this conversation, so even so early in the conversation of all of the various asks that the sector has. And I see Gil Barrow's face on the screen, our government relations advisor, who's constantly told us we need to focus as a sector, that we can't, be spread so thinly with multiple asks. Christoph, you and I were both quoted in the Le Devoir a couple of weeks ago by a journalist whose focus was on federal legislation, the importance of getting federal legislation in place. And we know that that was something that was in the last set of mandate letters. It's a struggle because I think as a sector, we might say that something like a federal tax incentive would have a much broader benefit to many more historic places across the country. But how do we get that clarity of focus? How do we coordinate the various priorities that we have as a sector?
Well, it is a critical question, and I think the efforts that we've collectively put into building different types of partnerships with non-traditional sectors, like the environmental sector, the efforts that we've made to get involved in policy discussions that are broader than strictly the heritage matters are the way to go. But it seems we still have quite a few miles to run before we are heard. Just to pick up on what Cody was saying also earlier, Canada has promoted itself as a leader in with regards to a number of international agreements and conventions, but we are still waiting to see the manifestation of Canada's leadership when it comes to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the UN New Urban Agenda, and those two, and even the Paris Agreement. Those three major tools that Canada claims to be a leader around all include significant provisions that respond to our asks and that would respond to our sector's need to get involved in abilities and we our cities. So I think our efforts have to continue in that vein, but we need to find even stronger arguments to make those messages heard, because Canada has already made those commitments.
Right, and I think we have to find ways to leverage the priorities that we see through the existing platforms. The real focus on retrofitting. I think our knee-jerk reaction is to say, "Oh my goodness, that will be dangerous for heritage buildings." How do we make sure that heritage buildings are treated separately from all of that funding? It's a challenge for us because we really do need to leverage and build on, and maybe not expect to see so many things specifically focused on heritage, but how do we take advantage of where the government and funding and programs are going?
I think one thing that stands out to me as well, and again, I know that platforms aren't necessarily fully nuanced, but there's a lot of discussion in all the platforms about national parks. And to me, that's always kind of a pro and a con for Indigenous cultural heritage. There's still this mindset about national parks are environmental landscapes that we have to preserve. They can't have, human interference, for instance. And historically, national parks have done a lot to displace Indigenous culture and Indigenous cultural heritage. But what's interesting is that the NDP platform, to bring that into focus, they said that they want to, every platform has allocated a specific percentage of territory in Canada that they want to see preserved as national parks. But the NDP platform has specifically said that that process will be situated within UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which I find very interesting, because if that process is in place, then there's going to be a lot about retaining the cultural land use of, and the traditional land use of these areas, which means resource extraction for some Indigenous peoples, sustainable use of plants and animals, for instance, which is in a lot of ways antithetical to how national parks are designed. But again, it goes back to this cultural heritage theme as well. And again, UNDRIP, I was surprised in a way, perhaps, to see that UNDRIP was not mentioned at all on the Conservative platform. And again, there's a chance that UNDRIP is kind of a big stepping stone for Indigenous cultural heritage moving forward, because there is specific provisions. Our new legislation says that all Canadian legislation has to be aligned with UNDRIP, which doesn't, it's kind of loose. But again, there's a lot of legislation in place that could indirectly impact Indigenous cultural heritage or cultural heritage more broadly. I know Christoph and Natalie have been leading figures as well to get built heritage legislation in place in Canada that will need to be aligned with UNDRIP. So again, to see it not mentioned in the Conservative platform, very, very loosely mentioned in the Liberal platform, surprisingly as well. But the NDP seems to be the only one where in a lot of specific sections they mentioned that this route will be situated, or this work will be situated in UNDRIP, including their discussion on some of their conversations about commemoration, and notably, as Keisha said at the beginning, their discussion on commemoration for Indigenous peoples is very much rooted in either national parks or the TRC, which leaves a lot of empty space in between.
Thanks, Cody. We've got lots of people on the screen here. I encourage you to jump in, raise your hand, or just turn on your mic and share your thoughts with us. I'm interested in hearing what you're doing, if you've been using the 3 election questions we put together, talking to candidates, what you're hearing in the ridings that you live and work in.
Really quickly, Cody, just to build on that while we're waiting for others to come jump into the fray. Just thinking about the national parks discussion, I just think are you seeing that also as part of the kind of the siloing of certain kinds of ways of thinking? We care about the environment, so we're thinking about the national parks and designating particular areas to be absolved from certain kinds of development. But it's free game in other places. I mean, it's interesting that there's that, and that kind of thinking seems to be something that we could contribute to in terms of looking at larger, cultural landscapes and others as being important areas for the work of both protecting cultural heritage, environmental, lessening environmental impact and saving carbon. Anyway, it's just interesting to see that them being naturally attracted to that feel-good subject of national parks, which is maybe too easy.
And I think what it comes down to is a lot of people in the heritage sector and a lot of people who are part of these calls have had these conversations about this delineation of nature and culture and how does that fit into the heritage sector. And that's conversations that are happening very actively, but in these platforms, it's very firm differentiation between nature and culture. And then, the heritage sector, when it is discussed, is great things about retrofitting. I was very happy to see that all the parties made commitments about gig workers, gig economy, summer workers, because that's the majority of heritage sector workers as well. But again, that differentiation makes it difficult.
Oh,
I see
Natalie,
Clint has his hand up.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. I'm just speaking about built heritage. A few thoughts. I was actually quite disappointed in the party's platforms. They've kind of gone in reverse. The Liberal platform offers no new funding. They mention heritage in passing as committed funding. Actually, the Green Party has gone in reverse. They had in their last platform explicit language about a tax credit and recognition of easement donations. This time, none of the platforms have anything. So what I have found to be at least for built heritage and financial incentives, the only effective strategy at this point is reaching out to individual candidates. In Windsor, for me, and Brian Massey with the NDP, Tracy Ramsey with the NDP, have both committed to trying to advance the tax credit if elected, and also reaching out to candidates in other areas of the country to try to get commitments, because now is the time to get commitments. So I talked to John Elbeg the other day in Cloverdale Langley with the Liberals. He again said that he would work hard to advance the tax credit and the 17 recommendations from the 2017 House of Commons report. So I think at this point, obviously stuff is not going to get in parties' platforms. It almost becomes an individual effort trying to nail down commitments from allies in the sector. I'll just leave it there. Or potential allies that could get elected. Thank you.
I could build on what Clint said in terms of what we can do now. Definitely, I think the platforms are out, but the reality is that a lot of us, we're many people here around the call, there's 50 people, each of us have access to our own either existing MP, our candidates in our respective ridings that we see or that we can go to in terms of different events. I know I'll be going to an event next week to talk to my existing MP and educate, because that's really what it's about. It's about understanding that, you know, there is a House of Commons report, but do we understand what retrofits mean? It's not enough to just, you know, throw money at replacing doors and windows. Just these like basic, I think, tenets of broadening the definition, understanding carbon, understanding, you know, old versus new, and the impacts of demolition. So it's an opportunity, because it's a campaign for all of us to educate those candidates that we see in our areas. And I think that's the role that heritage associations have in terms of helping to broaden people's understanding, so that if they're elected, then that's great. They can be an ally that we can then turn to moving forward. But it's a lot about education, because I think as a society, we've moved so much on this whole, particularly climate heritage access, that there still needs to be a lot of that, so that they can understand the true impact and the true connection between the two.
Right. Clint, you have your hand up again. Did you want to add something?
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize I had my hand up again, but I absolutely agree with that statement that was just made. When I talked to Brian Massey and Tracy, to moving ahead with financial incentives. In fact, Brian said that it should be an immediate priority if he's reelected, but it wasn't on his radar, and it wasn't on Tracy's radar either. These things are just not on people's radars. But I think if we get individual commitments from individuals at this point, having those allies in Parliament that we can go back and call on is just going to be major. And frankly, at this point, I think it's the only way to move ahead with that 2017 report and some of the specific recommendations in it.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And Theodora, thanks for that reminder. It really is about relationships and keeping this front and center with elected officials and with government. And I think that's real work we have to do as heritage organizations and individuals. And I think in our postmortem after was it 2016, so long ago, the private members bill proposing a federal tax incentive, in the aftermath of not getting that instituted at that time, I think we really had a hard conversation with ourselves at the Trust about what is really needed to build a bigger audience for heritage, to have many more supporters who understand what we're asking for and can be part of creating that bigger push. And maybe we'll talk a bit about that a bit later.
Natalie, I think Shane's got his hand raised there. Shane Edwards.
Yes,
hi, Shane.
yes. I hope you can use it. I put my hand up essentially to agree with Clint's approach, and then Theodora, of course, jumped in and confirmed that kind of approach, that we do have to make networks. Now, this is not my industry. I'm an interested, amateur advocate of built heritage, of history, of education, but we do it wrong if we don't talk to people outside our circles. We do it wrong if we don't bring people in. And I think when Clint said, I talked to him, he says he's really going to work forward, with the tax credit. Then the next thing should be, what do you need from us? What do you need? Keep that line open. It shouldn't be, okay, open the door, here's what we're doing, close the door, wait until we see what happened. We should be involved. We should be active. We talk to people about heritage, and I've dealt with heritage at the municipal level, the provincial level, the federal level over a lot of years. And most politicians don't listen very well. They don't hear it. They haven't become advocates. We haven't educated them very well, and we need to do that. And one of the ways, and I think Natalie said it earlier on, is we have to leverage our expertise. We have to leverage what we know. And we have to go with the groups, the environmentalists, the people who are, talking about building refits. We have to talk to them and say, okay, here's what we want to do. We see buildings, heritage buildings that are being lost every day, and the laws are in place to protect them. We have a building in my community that was designated, I think, 25 years ago. It was left to rot and decay on our main street. And a proposal was bought by the property owner. Oh, can we remove the heritage designation? And town council, okay, it can't be saved, it's gone. What kind of protection is that in place? And we have a very active heritage community here and a municipal heritage committee. And they go, well, we put that in place for a reason. You need to listen to us. Maybe we could take some time and look. And our council is usually very supportive, but on these sort of things, it goes by them. So I think we have to make the partnerships. We have to make them our allies, but they have to see us as their allies as well. There is so much that we need to do in that relationship. We don't do it very well. I talk to people and they talk about heritage and they support it when you talk to them. And when you leave the room, it becomes something else. I mean, and it's like this election. I asked or proposed that they ask a question about heritage at our local all candidates meeting, and it wasn't asked. We heard a lot of questions about retaining farmland, which is fair in my community. There's a lot of rural land, but I thought, wow, there's no room for even one question about heritage to be asked in a public forum like that, but apparently not. And yet I can go out and talk to all the people on the street and talk about heritage, and they listen to that. But I think we have to talk to people beyond our community. We have to have a strategy that makes that work. I was very pleased, I think, was it 2015, the Canadian Association of, forgotten their name. Anyway, they talked about heritage building resilience, and I firmly believe in that. And I think that's the tactic we should be taking. You want a resilient community. You want a community that knows its identity. You want a community that knows its heritage. And your heritage may go back one generation, it may go back 12 generations, it may go back to time immemorial, but you have to know your community's identity and your heritage if you're going to feel passionate about it and move forward. And if you're going to bring people in, we have to have a narrative. We can tell every politician, here's the narrative. And it has to be a compelling narrative. And that's what we need to do. And I say, we have so many experts out there. I mean, I know people on this call who have been very involved and accomplished a great deal over the years. And when you hear that, it's amazing. And I probably told this story before in this forum, but I remember Julian Smith spoke about the refurbishment or restoration of the Vimy Memorial. And I don't know if any of you know that story, but he came and he talked about engineering and he talked about that. This was at a community gala dinner we had, and he spoke. Everyone went out of that event going, wow, boy, that's Canadian heritage. That would made a real effort. But he talked about it with a passion, and he talked about its meaning. And as I say, I think, talks like that we don't hear very often, even within our own, even within the heritage community. But I'll tell you, politicians don't hear it very often either. But as I say, it was very impressive to hear Julian talk about engineering specs and people going, wow, that affected this. So when you talk about building retrofits, it sounds nice, but what does it really mean? So that's not my area of expertise, but what does it mean? What does it mean to you as a person? What does it mean to your community? And what does it do for you and your community? So I think that's the kind of messaging we have to get out. So we need a new messaging, because as I say, I've been involved on the periphery of heritage for a lot of years. And as I say, people are interested, they're intrigued, and their attention is diverted. They have to see the long-term benefit, and they have to know the passion that we bring to it. Anyway.
Hey, really great advice, Shane. And you're right that we really have work to do at all levels of government, not just at the federal level. And language is important. And we'll talk a bit more about that before we close. I see hands up, both Cody and Keisha from Indigenous Heritage Circle.
Yeah, so I really like the framing around heritage as part of resilience and about part of resilient communities. And I also just want to say, I think that coordination is really important in messaging, of sort of that we're not kind of pulling the heritage messaging apart in too many different directions. But I do think we're at a really important moment to advocate for more Indigenous involvement in heritage in Canada. Because in general, we've tended to be kind of not at the core of our own heritage stewardship, whether it be built heritage, whether it be parks, whether it be deeper, heritage from time immemorial. But if you want to build support resilient Indigenous communities, we need to focus not just on the trauma of residential schools, but also on the role of heritage and reconciliation for the future. So I think if there's a broader messaging around heritage as part of resilient communities, that there's a real opportunity to emphasize that the commitments around heritage need to go beyond through TRC calls to action and the work around residential school commemoration, that it really needs to be a more holistic understanding of Indigenous heritage, and then support organizations like the Indigenous Heritage Circle to actually be able to do that work. So I like that broader framing, and I think it leaves a lot of space for the advocacy work to come together. But I also just want to encourage folks on the call, to recognize that this is an important moment around Indigenous heritage in this particular election with what's going on. I've spent my entire summer helping Indigenous communities locate unmarked graves at residential schools. This is in people's conversation, and there's an opportunity here. And so I'd like to encourage folks to take up that opportunity to advocate in these ways.
Thank you, Keisha.
I'm not going to be as articulate as Keisha, but it's something that Clint mentioned about how we need to get, our thoughts and concerns actually to these candidates. And one thing reading the Green platform is I was impressed because they're the only party that has a specific section that says Indigenous culture and heritage, but also reading through it, I found it very general and perhaps not necessarily reflective of what communities are actually advocating for at this time. I see, for instance, establish a dedicated national funding program in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples and the Canadian Museum Association for commemoration projects on the theme of reconciliation. That's pulled almost exactly from a TRC. Funding was allocated for that. And I've worked with the Canadian Museum Association on a variety of projects, but there was also, I know, some thoughts from communities that money could have gone directly to communities instead of through that established organization already. Support the Canadian Museum Association to advance the 94 calls to action of a TRC and UNDRIP. Again, the Canadian Museum Association has even said in other capacities, I'm not speaking for them, that perhaps it's not their organization that should be spearheading that work necessarily, but that's pulled from the TRC. I also see providing funding and incentives for the development and of Indigenous art forms, and they say that was an original aim of the Professional Native Indian Artists Incorporated, which is from 1973. So that was the aim of that organization 50 years ago. But again, and then also they have a very specific one: support the creation of historical information that sheds light on our colonial past, to edit statuary or plaques that are currently in place. So again, that's very broad and generic. Plaques and monuments are, municipal, provincial. There's some federal in regards to the Historic Sites and Monuments Board. But again, I think that's a lot of sort of general promises and ideas that might not necessarily reflect some of the current heritage themes for Indigenous cultural heritage specifically, which I think is slightly problematic in a section that is geared towards Indigenous culture and heritage. But that's just a thought I had that sort of Clint inspired me to think of.
Thanks, Cody. And Chris, you have your hand up. Chris Uchianama.
Yeah, I think just not to steal thunder from where we're going sort of towards the end of this, but I think what's coming up a lot is that, yes, this is an opportunity to educate politicians. And I love the three questions. I've sent them to my own candidates. And one of the interesting things has been reading how those questions are being interpreted. And I think this is a great opportunity also for us as a sector to educate ourselves on what are the views and the responses that are coming back, and how do we shape our messaging? Because, Keisha's right, we are at a watershed moment for so many different aspects of society, of our sector. And I think we need to really take advantage of this, because at the end of this election, which is a very short cycle, as short as it can possibly be, we're going to have to, work with whatever government is formed, and ultimately this is where the real work begins, and this is when we need to start advocating and forming our messaging and figuring out how to take advantage of whatever platform and whatever promises have been made.
Absolutely. No, you're right. And a new session of Parliament it's a fresh start and an opportunity for us to work together more closely. Chris Weeb and I have talked a lot about our admiration for the Green Budget Coalition. So in the environmental sector, I think 19 national environmental organizations work together in a coordinated way, not just on the eve of an election or pulling together their budget submission, but year round in coordinating their messaging and identifying, which of their, I'm sure many asks, maybe more than the heritage sector would have, which ones they will focus on and speak with the united voice and in order to really get as much traction as possible. And I'm so excited I think this is the first session we've had around federal advocacy where we've had our national partners, the Indigenous Heritage Circle, ECOMOS Canada, and the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals all around the table talking together about advocacy and government relations. And I hope that we can continue to work together in that way, because we're definitely so much stronger together. And with our collective membership, we can share coordinated messages and questions and toolkits and make sure that everyone is out there speaking to as many candidates and elected officials through the year as we can. There's been a lot of talk about messaging through the course of this session, and I did want to share with you so I think a related initiative that we're looking for more partners for and also more funding. And I think I mentioned earlier that after the failure to get traction with that private members bill calling for a tax incentive for heritage rehabilitation, in our postmortem, we really talked about the importance of, I think at the beginning, it started to be about branding, like how do we rebrand the heritage movement to get better traction with a much bigger audience so that we have, many more Canadians who are with us in the call for these kinds of public policy changes that we need. And then, so we started a project that was about broadening the audience, but in parallel, I think the whole world changed around us with the pandemic and events that have really called on all of us to do what we can to redress social and racial inequities, to be part of climate action and to think about how to change the economic status quo. And so you've probably all been following the plans for our upcoming conference, which we're calling the Heritage Reset, Heritage and the Global Reset. So in parallel, this project about audience has really evolved into an initiative that is about reframing our values as a heritage sector. So not so much about convincing everyone else to believe what we believe, but to really examine our own beliefs and our own goals in the heritage sector to get better alignment. And so I think on the screen here shows the goals that we've shaped for this project, which includes these national partners that you see on the screen and many other heritage organizations. So it's really about helping more people see the heritage movement as a positive, active, progressive force in addressing pressing issues in our society. And really, are we as a sector, are we a progressive, active force? What do we need to tweak and adjust in the way that we think about our heritage goals to really resonate with a much broader audience and to really be part of the solution to these issues that we see in our society? So this initiative is really about examining the sector itself, having a tough conversation with ourselves about what we need to do to build a more diverse practice in heritage conservation. How do we attract the next generation? How can we be more relevant and include many others in the work that we do? And then finally, that third goal is about getting smarter about where to invest our energy. As we heard today, we have so many public policy goals, that we all share, and how can we work together and focus on really getting traction in the priority areas. So as I said, this is a project that we're launching with many partners. We're looking for more partners. We have a little better than half the funding assembled to carry out a project over 2 years that will culminate in a bilingual public campaign. But in the process, we'll build a stronger case for support for heritage and do some of that work with language and messaging that we've all identified the need for here today. So that's a great segue to ask Chris to tell us a little bit about our upcoming conference, which will be a sort of public launch of this work that we're doing at the Trust. Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. And I think coming back to what Clint was saying, now we need to get out and talk, and others, and Theodora and others were saying about talking to individual MPs and really sort of finding our allies in Parliament, so that when we need to go and talk about private members' bills and other things to get things on the political agenda, we have friends in those places. So yeah, this the upcoming conference is really building on what Natalie's talking about in terms of trying to find alignment, trying to it's about making better messages or getting our communicating better, but it's also involves that introspection she was talking about in terms of examining where our processes have been a part of the problem, both in terms of inequities of various kinds, social or economic, and where we need to change in order to create a better, more vibrant heritage movement. So the conference, I mean, there's going to be great speakers and really interesting international figures and discussions, but there's also going to be an element of it around, a strong element running through it around discussion, particularly reflecting and bouncing and sort of taking apart a discussion, a Heritage Reset discussion paper that we're currently developing, and that will be circulated in advance of the conference. It's not going to be long, don't worry. It's going to be quite pithy and compact, but something to really sort of try to spur along that conversation that we know we need to have in terms of the reset, both ourselves and the way we demonstrate or communicate ourselves into the public sphere. So I encourage you to come to the virtual conference this year. It's on 4 afternoons, so you can fit it into your rest of your life. Hopefully, we've designed it that way, and as with everything else. And so hopefully we'll see some of you there, and we can continue the conversation in that space as well. Natalie.
Great, thanks, Chris. And Kirsten shared the link to the conference website in the chat. I might just draw your attention as we wind things down today back to those questions. And again, I think Kirsten shared the link to the advocacy action section on our website, where you can find all the documents that we referred to today. Again, in the last few days in the run up to the election, I encourage you to get out there and get those questions out and talk to candidates, build those relationships that we need to strengthen the movement going forward. I'm sure you all join me in thanking everyone who participated today, everyone on the line. You're all part of this conversation, and especially the leaders of these national heritage organizations that were on the line with us today. Thanks to Chris at Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals, Keisha and Cody at Indigenous Heritage Circle, Christophe Rivet at ICOMOS Canada, and Theodora Samiotis, who is straddling a couple of organizations, and happy to have her on board in these conversations as well. So I think without further ado, we'll wrap up today's session and encourage you to stay involved. Thanks so much. Merci beaucoup.